Why was the commander staring at her like that? Not with impatience, not with the casual dismissal she had grown used to, but with something else, something he hadn't shown in years of combat. It wasn't fear of the enemy or of death, it was awe, and the reason was her. But rewind the clock just 3 weeks, and she was no one special at all. Just a nurse. Just another face at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, tucked somewhere in the desert like a secret no one bothered to keep. Lieutenant Rogers, 26 years old, Wisconsin-born, steady green eyes, hands that seemed too calm for the chaos she was surrounded by. She had finished her nursing degree with honors, then traded the safety of hospital walls for desert sand and gunmetal sky. Not because she loved danger, but because she loved people. Because she wanted to serve the ones who served. And yet here at the base, she was invisible. For 3 weeks she had walked the narrow halls of the aid station, handed out ibuprofen to men twice her size, patched up blisters, treated sunburns, and wrapped twisted ankles. The SEALs, those 12 warriors who lived like blades sharpened for war, barely noticed her. She was Doc, the one who taped their knuckles when training went too far or cleaned the gravel from their knees when they fell running drills. They respected her only in the way a soldier respects a mechanic. Useful, necessary, replaceable. Commander Venom had made it clear from the beginning. She's just a nurse, not combat personnel. The platoon had nodded. Orders were orders, and well, she heard it too, she always did. She knew her place in their eyes. She wasn't built like them, didn't carry scars across her arms or hardened lines across her face. She wasn't the one standing in briefing rooms with tactical maps lit red by projector light. She was always in the back, quiet, watching, invisible. That morning had been no different. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Reconnaissance patrol through the jagged mountain valleys, 3 up-armored vehicles, a dozen SEALs, routine. Commander briefed them with precision, his voice steady, clipped, professional. His second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Razor, marked their tactical points, grid coordinates flashing on the screen. Medical personnel will establish an aid station at grid reference Delta 7, said, his tone final. Treat casualties, coordinate evacuation, maintain communications. He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to. Nodded, though no one was looking for her agreement. She was there to patch wounds, not to be part of the mission. That's what they always told her. That's what she always accepted. But that morning, as she strapped her medical kit to her chest, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling pressing against her ribs. Something about the valley they were headed toward felt wrong. Too quiet. Too simple. She thought about speaking up, asking if they'd considered alternate routes, but she silenced herself. Who was she to question them? So she rode in the third vehicle, trailing behind the others, headset crackling with radio chatter, her eyes on the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, heat mirages dancing across sand and stone. To anyone else, it might have looked empty. It looked like a wound waiting to open. And then it did. The first explosion hit like the sky had cracked open. A thunderclap beneath the lead vehicle lifted the truck off the ground, twisted steel folding as it slammed back into the earth. A wall of fire roared up, tearing sand into the air. The second blast tore through the convoy seconds later, targeting the vehicle that swerved to avoid the wreckage. It flipped twice, metal shrieking, soldiers inside screaming as gravity punished them. Breath caught in her throat. She barely had time to brace before the third explosion ripped into the road ahead, fire curling into the air like the desert itself was burning. Her own vehicle shuddered, thrown sideways by the concussive wave. She hit the door hard enough to black out for seconds, or maybe longer. When her eyes opened, the world was wrong, tilted, deafening. The convoy was gone. What remained was wreckage and silence. And then, slowly, the silence cracked into screams. She forced herself upright. Her head throbbed. Blood trickled down her temple. But her mind went instantly to one thought: the men. Radio static hissed. A voice cut through, fractured but desperate. "Chief. Medical emergency. Multiple casualties. Urgent surgical required." Through the haze of smoke and dust she saw them. The SEALs, scattered across the sand like broken toys. The lead vehicle mangled, its crew thrown meters away. The second overturned, flames licking at its undercarriage. The third, hers, miraculously intact, though burning fuel stained the air. And in the middle of it, Commander crawled toward his men, blood streaming from his scalp, eyes wild. "Rogers," his voice was raw, cracked with panic. "We need immediate medical assistance." She looked at the battlefield. 12 men, 12 brothers in arms, all bleeding, all broken, all fatting. Something inside her shifted. This was the moment she had trained for. This was the moment she had feared. The line between life and death now ran through her hands. 18 minutes, that was all she had. She grabbed her medical kit, her carbine, and without hesitation she sprinted into the fire. Was the first. He lay 20 meters from the lead vehicle, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, bone protruding, blood pumping into the sand. His face was ashen, lips blue. He was seconds from gone. She dropped to her knees, hands steady, mind sharper than the chaos around her. "Stay with me, you hear me?" His eyes flickered open, glassy. "Doc, how bad?" She forced a smile she didn't feel. "Bad enough that you're going home. Good enough that you're going to walk your daughter down the aisle." Her hands moved fast, pressure on the femoral artery, tourniquet tight around his thigh, IV line pushed into his arm, saline flowing, life pouring back. 1 stabilized, 11 to go. Bullets cracked overhead. She looked up, enemy fire from the ridges. The explosions had been only the beginning. Now came the ambush. Automatic bursts stitched the sand around her. His voice roared across the field. "Incoming, take cover." But she didn't move. She couldn't. Because if she stopped now, would die. She pressed her body low, shielding him with her frame while her hands kept working. When the bleeding slowed, when his pulse steadied, only then did she lift her rifle and fire controlled bursts into the hillside. Not to kill, to buy seconds. Seconds were lives. And she would spend everyone she had. By the time she finished with, her lungs burned from smoke, her ears rang with gunfire, and her hands were slick with blood that wasn't hers. She scanned the battlefield, 11 more, each one bleeding time, each one waiting for her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be here, on the ground, with the war pressing down on her from every angle. She was supposed to stay behind the lines. Supposed to treat sprains. Supposed to be invisible. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Not today, not here. She rose, kit in one hand, rifle in the other. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the base 3 weeks ago, the SEAL commander wasn't dismissing her. He was watching her, frozen, silent, and in his eyes for the first time there was no doubt. Only awe. What kind of person runs toward gunfire instead of away from it? That was the thought flashing through his mind as he pressed his palm against his bleeding head, his vision blurred, his men scattered like broken glass across the desert floor. And then he saw her. Rogers, the nurse he had barely spoken to, the one who always sat in the back of the briefing room, quiet, invisible. She wasn't invisible now. She was moving across open ground, kit pressed to her chest, rifle in her hand, eyes fixed on her next patient as bullets tore the earth around her. He wanted to call her back, wanted to scream for her to take cover, but something in the way she moved, calm, unshaken, made him stop. Because whatever she was about to do, it wasn't hesitation. It was war. Was the second. She spotted him near the overturned vehicle, blood streaking his temple, his body twisted against the sand. His helmet was cracked, his lips moving without sound. When she reached him, the signs were unmistakable: traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding, maybe worse. His eyes flickered, focusing on her face. His voice rasped, broken but stubborn. "Doc, perimeter. Gotta set perimeter." He tried to push himself upright, his hand clawing toward the weapon half buried in the dirt. His body was failing him, but his training was. Pressed her palm hard against his chest, forcing him back down. Her tone cut like a blade. "Chief, listen to me. I've got the perimeter. Your job is to stay still and let me keep you alive." She fired a quick burst over his shoulder, the M4 rattling in her grip, rounds driving back, the muzzle flashes flickering on the ridge. Her body shielded him as she worked, sliding a cervical collar around his neck with hands steady as stone. "Head injury serious," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Vitals are weak, internal bleeding, damn it." She fished for an IV line, pushed fluids into his system, watching the monitor beep faintly against the chaos. The desert felt like it was closing in, heat, fire, bullets. But her world shrank to a single square foot, his face, his pulse, his survival. His eyes found hers again. Am I going under?" Her voice softened, just for a breath. "Not on my watch." For the first time, Chief obeyed an order without question. He let his eyes close. The third casualty was harder. Not because of skill, but because of distance. Petty Officer Williams lay 20 meters away, sprawled against the twisted wreck of the communications truck. His chest barely rose, his breaths ragged, wet. She could see the dark bloom of blood spreading across his uniform. And between her and him, open ground, no cover, no shield. Enemy fire cut across it like invisible blades. Her brain screamed protocol: stay down, wait for cover fire, assess risk. But her heart didn't, because she knew what those gasping breaths meant. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing. He was drowning inside his own chest. Minutes, that's all he had, maybe less. She didn't think, she moved. Dropping flat, she low-crawled across the sand, Kit dragging behind her, bullets chewing dirt inches from her legs. Each second felt like eternity. Each meter was a fight against gravity and fear. When she reached him, she pressed her ear against his chest. Faint breath sounds, one side only. The other was silent. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, lips trembling. "Doc," he coughed blood. "Got 2 kids, 7 and 9. She swallowed hard. "Tell me their names." "Sarah, Michael. They think I'm a hero." Her hands worked with machine precision, prepping the chest tube while her heart twisted. Enemy fire hissed overhead, but her focus narrowed to a single puncture wound between his ribs. She slid the tube in, her fingers slick, her jaw tight. Air hissed out, blood followed, and then breath. Full, ragged, desperate, but breath. His chest rose again. Leaned close. "You are a hero, and they'll think that for the next 60 years. She sealed the wound, packed the abdominal trauma as best she could, then dragged him backward behind cover, her own body taking the brunt of dirt and debris raining down. 3 stabilized, 9 to go. And time was bleeding away. Watched her from across the battlefield, still pressing the bandage against his head. His men were groaning, shouting, trying to reload and fight while half-conscious. But it wasn't the enemy that terrified him now. It was her. Or rather, it was the realization of what she was doing. He had seen medics work under pressure, had seen men drag comrades from fire, but never this. Never someone dividing herself in half, doctor and soldier at once, shifting between rifle and scalpel without hesitation. He caught himself whispering aloud, almost like a prayer. How is she doing this? The truth wasn't thinking about how. She wasn't thinking at all. She was acting, moving, becoming. Every casualty she touched anchored her deeper into a reality she hadn't known she carried. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't support. She was the only thing standing between life and death for 12 warriors. By the time she reached Martinez, smoke was so thick it clawed at her lungs. His body was scorched, flames having kissed his skin when the vehicle burned. 30% surface burns. Severe. Inhalation damage. He writhed weakly, his voice cracked and broken. Doc hurts. Knelt, syringe in one hand, rifle in the other. She jabbed morphine into his vein, her voice low and steady, the way her mother had once spoken to her as a child during storms. The pain will get better, stay with me, just focus on my voice. As the morphine dulled his agony, she threaded an IV line, pouring fluids to fight the shock tearing through his body. But she couldn't afford to stay long. Flames were still creeping closer. She shifted, sighted down her rifle, and fired 3 precise bursts into the ridge. Enemy silhouettes dropped back behind rocks. To Martinez she smiled faintly. "See, I've got you covered." To herself she whispered, "Don't you dare die on me." 4 stabilized, 8 left. Her arms were trembling now, not from fear but from exertion. Sweat mixed with blood. Her own lungs screamed from smoke. And yet she kept moving. Because stopping meant choosing who died first, and she refused. The 5th casualty was Petty Officer Santos. She found him clutching at what remained of his left hand, the limb gone at the wrist, blood pumping in sick rhythm with his heartbeat. His face was white with shock, his lips forming the same words over and over. "My hand, my hand, my hand." Caught his chin, forcing his eyes to hers. "Not your hand, look at me." "Doc, my hand." "It's gone, but you're not, you hear me. You're still here, and I'm not letting you go." She snapped a tourniquet high on his arm, the rubber biting into skin, the bleeding slowing. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, her hands moving fast, efficient, unflinching. His gaze locked on hers, wild with fear. "Doc, am I gonna make it?" Her jaw clenched, her throat burned, but her voice never shook. "Yes, you're going home, they'll fix you up, you'll live, you'll laugh, you'll fight again if you want to, this doesn't end you." He blinked hard, tears mixing with dust. For the first time since she'd reached him, he believed her. 5 stabilized, 7 left. And now, every second felt heavier. But then she saw him. Lee. The 6th casualty. And with him came the choice that would haunt her forever. He lay sprawled in the open just yards from the burning wreckage, his spine twisted at an angle that screamed disaster. Spinal trauma. Protocol was clear. Immobilize, don't move. Movement risks paralysis, may be worse. But gunfire was slicing the air around him. Shards of burning metal rained down. If she left him there, he'd die before any evacuation could reach them. Her training said no, her heart said yes. She made the choice. Crawling to him, she pressed her hands against his shoulders, her voice steady, commanding. "Lee, I'm moving you, don't help, don't fight me, just trust me." He groaned, pain etched across every line of his face, but he didn't resist. With every ounce of strength in her body, dragged him backward across the sand, keeping his spine aligned, her muscles screaming, her vision swimming. When she finally got him behind cover, she collapsed beside him, chest heaving, hands trembling. Then she set to work, immobilizing, stabilizing, checking vitals. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "You're safe now, I've got you." 6 stabilized, 6 more. And only one thought beat like a drum inside her skull. "I can't lose a single one." How much can one person take before they break? That question pressed in on as she dragged her aching body toward the next scream. Her arms burned, her throat seared from smoke, and her hands trembled from blood loss, not her own, but theirs. 6 men stabilized, 6 left, and every second stretched like a knife edge cutting into her resolve. Her legs wanted to give out, her lungs wanted to collapse, but her heart would not let her stop. Because stopping meant choosing who didn't make it, and she refused to choose. The 7th casualty was Johnson. He had shrapnel embedded across his legs and abdomen, his face pale as chalk. When she knelt beside him, his lips barely moved. "Doc, can't feel my legs." Her fingers probed gently, quickly. Shrapnel wounds, multiple, abdominal bleed. His femoral pulse was weak. He wasn't just losing blood, he was losing hope. She gripped his hand, squeezing tight, her voice steady but fierce. You can't feel your legs because I'm not letting you move them. You've got a family waiting for you, Johnson, and you're not checking out today. She applied hemostatic gauze, pressed deep, started IV fluids, and tied off bandages with knots as tight as her own clenched jaw. He gasped in pain, tried to pull away, but she forced him to hold still. Pain means you're alive. Don't fight me, fight to stay awake. He blinked against tears, nodding faintly. When his vitals stabilized, she let herself breathe. 1 second, no more. 7 down, 5 left. Brown was next. She found him slumped against the burning shell of the second vehicle, his eyes unfocused, blood seeping from his scalp. Concussion, possible skull fracture. When she touched his temple, he winced, his hand weakly batting hers away. Doc, I'm fine, help the others. She shook her head, pressing him gently back against the wreck. You're not fine, and I don't leave anyone behind. He tried to laugh, but it broke into a cough. You're stubborn. Her lips curved in the faintest smile. So are you, that's why we're both here. She wrapped his head, monitored his pupils, checked vitals. He was concussed, yes, but alive, stabilized. 8 down, 4 left. Davis was harder. Penetrating chest wounds. Blood bubbling with every breath, staining his uniform dark. He looked at her with wide eyes, gasping, choking, drowning. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, fingers moving with terrifying calm. Seal the wound. Insert the needle. Relieve the pressure. The hiss of escaping air was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. His lungs expanded again, his breaths ragged but fuller. His eyes cleared just enough to lock on hers. You saved me. She shook her head softly, her hands still working. Not yet, but I will. 9 down, 3 left. White came next. Both legs broken, possible internal bleeding. He groaned with every shallow movement, his face twisted in agony. She splinted the fractures with field materials, stabilized his vitals, and pushed morphine into his arm. His shoulders finally relaxed, the tremors easing. Doc, his voice was weak but grateful. I owe you my life. She tightened the bandage one last time, her eyes locking with his. No, you owe me nothing. You owe them everything. Get home. Live your life. That's the only repayment I want. 10 down, 2 left. And that's when she found him. The youngest. He was only 19, barely out of training, barely old enough to wear the uniform he had bled into. The blast had torn through his chest and abdomen, leaving him sprawled in the sand, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clawing weakly at the air. When she reached him, she froze for half a second, just half, but in that half her heart cracked. His injuries were catastrophic, surgical. He needed a hospital, a team, equipment she didn't have, but what he had was her, and what she had was time slipping like sand through her fingers. She pressed her hands against his wounds, forcing pressure, forcing herself not to cry when his blood oozed hot between her fingers. His lips trembled, his voice so faint she almost missed it. Doc, am I going to die? The words hit her harder than any bullet ever could. She had heard that question before, in emergency rooms, in sterile hospitals where machines beeped and lights hummed. But here, with enemy fire cracking overhead, the question was heavier, louder. She wanted to lie, she wanted to scream, she wanted to tell him she didn't know. But she couldn't. Because if she let him see her doubt, he was gone. So she locked her eyes on his and spoke with the kind of certainty that wasn't just for him. It was for her. You're not going to die. Not today, not here, not on my watch. His lips quivered into the faintest smile. Promise. Her throat burned, her chest ached, but she forced the word out. I promise. And she meant it, even if it meant tearing herself apart to keep it. She worked like fury, sealing, bandaging, stabilizing. Every movement a prayer, every breath a fight against despair. She didn't know if he would make it through surgery later, but she knew he would make it through now. And sometimes, now is all you can give. 11 down, 1 left. The 12th casualty was Morgan. And when she saw him, her heart sank. He had been thrown from the lead vehicle, his body broken in too many places to count. Head trauma, chest injuries, abdominal wounds, both legs fractured. He looked like death already had its hand on him, pulling him away. Her hands hovered for one heartbeat. Her mind screamed at her, "This is impossible. He won't make it, not out here, not like this." But then she remembered his eyes, his question, her promise. And she realized, if she gave up on Morgan, she was breaking that promise to all of them. So she did what no textbook, no manual, no training had ever told her was possible. She performed field surgery. Right there under fire with nothing but a trauma kit and raw determination, she opened wounds that weren't supposed to be opened outside an operating room, repaired arterial bleeding, relieved chest pressure, stabilized fractures, packed abdominal wounds. Her hands moved with impossible precision, her breath ragged, her body screaming but her soul unyielding. Every second felt like eternity, every movement a gamble. But when it was done, when she finally leaned back, sweat dripping, blood staining her uniform, she looked at him. His pulse was there, weak, fragile, but there. Alive. 18 minutes. That's how long it had been since the first explosion tore the desert open. 18 minutes since death had laid claim to 12 men. And in those 18 minutes, Rogers had stood between them and the grave. She keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. "Commander, medical assessment complete. All 12 casualties stabilized for evacuation. No KIA, all survivable with surgical intervention." Static filled the silence. For 10 long seconds, no reply. Then's voice, hoarse, disbelieving. "Rogers, repeat that transmission." She swallowed, forcing the words out again. "All 12 casualties stable and ready for evacuation, sir. No fatalities." This time the silence wasn't disbelief, it was awe. Looked around the battlefield that should have been a graveyard. 12 men who had been dying minutes earlier were now breathing, conscious, stable. He looked back at her, covered in blood, weapon still in hand, eyes blazing with something he'd never seen in her before. And in that moment, he realized something that would haunt him forever. She was just a nurse. She was the only reason any of them were still alive. What does silence sound like after chaos? Not the silence of peace, not the kind you find in quiet forests or still lakes, but the kind that comes after screams have faded, after gunfire has stopped, when the weight of what almost happened presses down heavier than the noise ever did. That was the silence in the valley. 18 minutes ago, it had been an ambush. Explosions ripping steel apart, gunfire stitching the air, death circling like a vulture overhead. Now it was still, too still. 12 men lay in the sand, groaning, breathing, alive. Their blood had painted the desert, but it hadn't claimed them. Not one. And in the middle of it stood Lieutenant Rogers, her uniform drenched in crimson, her hands trembling, her chest heaving. Rifle in one hand, medical kit at her feet. She wasn't sure how she was still upright. Her body screamed for rest, her vision blurred at the edges, but she couldn't stop. Not yet, not until they were safe. Not until she could hand them over alive. The sound of rotor blades reached her ears before she saw them. The medevac birds. 2 Black Hawks cut low across the valley, kicking up clouds of dust and smoke as they descended. Their rotors churned the air into a storm, blowing the battlefield into a haze. Keyed her radio, her voice hoarse but steady. "LZ secure, casualties stabilized, immediate extraction required." Commander's voice broke through behind her. raw with both relief and disbelief. "Rogers, how the hell did you do this?" She didn't answer, couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the helicopters touching down, on the men with stretchers sprinting into the chaos. Her hands moved again, directing, pointing, triaging. She was running on instinct now, on the same unyielding force that had carried her through the last 18 minutes. This one first, massive blood loss, head injury stabilized, needs ore within 30 minutes. Second bird takes Martinez and Santos, burn trauma and amputation, keep fluids going. Don't touch chest wound until surgical team's ready. He's stable now, keep it that way. The flight medics stared at her, wide-eyed. Not because of the injuries, they'd seen plenty of those, but because she was speaking with the authority of someone who had already done the impossible. And they obeyed without question. One by one, the SEALs were loaded, groaning, breathing, clinging to life, but alive. Moved among them, touching a shoulder here, checking a bandage there, whispering words only they could hear. "Stay with me. You're going home. You promised me 60 more years, don't forget." Every man she touched looked at her like she was something they couldn't quite understand. Not a nurse, not a soldier, something in between. By the time the last stretcher was lifted, her legs nearly gave out. She dropped to one knee, the dust swirling around her as the Black Hawks roared higher. And when the valley finally fell silent again, she realized she was alone. Just her, just the wreckage, just the smell of smoke and blood clinging to the air. Stumbled toward her, still pressing a field dressing against his head. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with blood and grime. He stopped a few feet away, staring at her like he didn't know who he was looking at. This wasn't the quiet nurse he'd dismissed in the briefing room. This wasn't the support staff he'd waved toward the back. This was someone else entirely. "Rogers," his voice cracked low, 12 men should die today, 12, and yet. He shook his head, like the words wouldn't come. Finally looked up at him, her eyes steady, her body trembling. She forced herself to stand, swaying but refusing to let him see her fall. "They needed medical attention," she said softly, "and I provided it. That's what nurses do." It wasn't pride, it wasn't arrogance, it was truth, simple, unshakable. But knew better. He knew he'd just witnessed something that went beyond medicine, beyond training, beyond anything he'd seen in all his years of combat. And for the first time in his career, the hardened SEAL commander was speechless. Hours later, the base was quiet. The survivors had been rushed into operating rooms, surgeons working furiously to finish what had started in the sand. Reports came back one by one, stabilized, stable, critical but holding. Alive. Every single one. Stood outside the surgical wing, arms folded, head still bandaged, staring through the glass as doctors and nurses swarmed his men. He had led them into a death trap, had watched them torn apart in seconds, had been powerless to stop it. And yet they were alive because of her. He closed his eyes, the image replaying in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The explosions, the gunfire, the bodies in the sand, and through it all her. Crawling under fire, bandaging with one hand while firing with the other, speaking promises she had no right to make and keeping them anyway. For 18 minutes she had carried them all. And he couldn't shake the question that haunted him. How? Sat alone in the corner of the ward, her body wrapped in silence. Her hands were scrubbed raw, though the smell of blood still clung to her skin. Her uniform was gone, replaced with clean fatigues, but she could still feel the weight of it, soaked with red. She should have felt relief, pride, triumph. Instead, she felt hollow. Her mind replayed every second, every choice, every word she had spoken to the men. His glazed eyes, his broken voice, Williams whispering his children's names, asking her if he was going to die. That one cut deepest, his voice still echoed in her chest, every syllable sharp. "Promise me." She had promised, and she had delivered. But promises like that take something from you, something you don't get back. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her head in her hands. For the first time since the blasts, her body shook, not from exhaustion, not from injury, from the weight of what she had refused to let happen. Approached quietly, his boots echoing in the sterile hallway. He stopped at the edge of the ward, watching her. This was not the woman he had dismissed. This was not just a nurse. This was the reason 12 men were breathing tonight. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Rogers." She lifted her head slowly, her eyes red but steady. "I misjudged you," he admitted. The words felt heavy, foreign in his mouth. "When I first saw you, I thought you were here to hand out aspirin, to patch scrapes. I thought you'd slow us down, I thought." He stopped, swallowing hard. She didn't speak, didn't let him off the hook, just waited. "I was wrong," he finished. "You saved my men, you saved me. I'll never forget that." Her lips twitched into the faintest smile. Not joy, not triumph, just something softer, sadder. "Commander," she said quietly, "we're all on the same team. We just use different tools." And with that, she lowered her gaze again, as though the weight of his words was too much to carry. Stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once firmly before turning away. But in his heart, he knew the truth. She hadn't just saved them. She had redefined what it meant to be part of his team. That night, as the desert cooled and the base fell silent, lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She could still feel the battlefield beneath her hands, still hear the rotor blades, still see their faces. 12 men who should have been dead. 12 men who had looked at her and found something they didn't expect. She had done what no one believed possible, what even she hadn't believed until the moment demanded it. But she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Because word would spread, questions would come, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Why did the Pentagon want to see her? That question followed all the way from the desert to Washington. It echoed in her mind on the long flight, through the sterile corridors, even as she sat outside the briefing room in her crisp uniform, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to matter this much. And yet 12 men lived because of her. That fact had reached the highest levels faster than she could comprehend. Reports had been filed, testimonies written, commanders called, and somewhere in the middle of it all, her name had become something it had never been before. Not just a nurse. Not support staff. Now she was the subject of Pentagon briefings. And she hated it. The doors opened with a hiss and a voice called her name. "Lieutenant Rogers, they're ready for you." She stood, her knees stiff, her breath tight in her chest. The man who led her inside was older, his uniform lined with ribbons, his face unreadable. He gestured toward the long mahogany table surrounded by men and women in dark suits and decorated uniforms. At the far end, a general leaned forward, steepling his fingers. His voice carried the weight of decades. "Lieutenant Rogers, please sit." She obeyed, lowering herself into the chair, her back straight despite the weight pressing down on her. A woman in a suit spoke first, her tone clinical. "Lieutenant, we've reviewed the after-action reports. You stabilized 12 critically wounded SEALs under enemy fire in 18 minutes. No fatalities." The words hung heavy in the air, felt her stomach twist. She didn't want to relive it, didn't want the roomful of strangers dissecting those minutes like they were some kind of blueprint. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. The general leaned forward. "How did you do it?" She blinked. "Sir." "How did you manage what every field medic and combat surgeon in the military would have considered impossible?" Her throat tightened. Her mind flashed back, the blasts, the screams, the eyes filled with fear. Williams whispering his children's names, asking her if he was going to die. She forced herself to answer, even though the words felt small compared to what had happened. They needed medical attention, and I provided it. That's what nurses do. The room shifted, murmurs passing between them, some skeptical, some impressed. The general's gaze never left her. "Lieutenant, you didn't just provide medical care. You performed procedures outside of protocol. You engaged in defensive combat while treating casualties. You moved a spinal patient under fire. You performed field surgery that wasn't supposed to be possible. Do you understand what that means?" His fingers tightened against the table. She didn't want to understand. She didn't want to be dissected, labeled, turned into a doctrine. All she wanted was to save lives. "Sir," she said quietly, "circumstances don't change responsibility. They were my patients. I wasn't going to let them die." The room fell silent. And in that silence, they realized something she already knew. This wasn't just about skill. This was about refusal, about defiance in the face of inevitability. When the meeting ended, she was escorted out into the cold Washington air. She stood alone for a moment, her breath clouding in front of her, her heart pounding. Inside that room, she had just changed something she couldn't quite name. She didn't want fame. She didn't want recognition. But whether she liked it or not, the military now saw her differently. And that terrified her more than the battlefield ever had. Back at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, whispers already circulated before she returned. Doc Rogers saved the whole team. She patched 12 guys under fire. They're calling it the Rogers Protocol. Everywhere she walked, heads turned. Operators who had once barely noticed her now stopped, saluted, nodded with quiet respect. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt exposed. Because she knew the truth. She wasn't a miracle worker. She wasn't invincible. She was just someone who refused to let go when everyone else had. But in their eyes, she had become something else, something larger than life. Weeks passed. She threw herself back into routine, bandaging training injuries, checking vitals, cleaning wounds. But the Pentagon hadn't forgotten. Neither had her commanders. One evening found her in the medical tent, her sleeves rolled up, her hands steady as she stitched a gash on a young soldier's arm. "Rogers," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "Commander." He waited until she tied the knot, trimmed the thread, and patted the soldier on the shoulder. Only then did she meet his gaze. "They want you in D.C. again," he said. "New assignment." Her chest tightened. "I don't want a new assignment." "It's not about what you want," said, though his voice wasn't hard. It was almost gentle. "They're building something around you, training, doctrine. They think you've redefined combat medicine." She shook her head, her jaw tight. "I didn't redefine anything. I just refused to let them die." His eyes softened. He'd seen plenty of warriors, plenty of medics, plenty of men and women who broke under the weight of the battlefield. He knew what made her different. And he knew she didn't want to hear it. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "refusing is enough to change everything." She turned away, her throat tight. Because deep down she feared he was right. When she returned to Washington weeks later, it wasn't for questioning. It was for purpose. The Pentagon wanted her to design something new, a program, a doctrine, a way to prepare others for what she had done in those 18 minutes. They called it advanced combat medical training, but it was something simpler, something raw. She taught them not to give up, not to accept death when intervention was still possible, not to hide behind protocol when lives demanded more. She showed them how to stabilize under fire, how to treat while fighting, how to think like both a medic and a soldier. Her students struggled, some broke, but the ones who stayed, the ones who pushed through, emerged sharper, stronger, more capable of defying the impossible. It wasn't just training, it was survival. And though she never admitted it aloud, part of her was haunted. Because every time she stood in front of a classroom, every time she demonstrated a procedure, She saw their faces again. Williams, Martinez, Santos, Lee, Johnson, Brown, Davis, White, Morgan. 12 men she had carried for 18 minutes. 12 men who had changed her life forever. She had saved them, but they had marked her. Late one night, long after the classrooms had emptied and the lights in the Pentagon hallways dimmed, she stood alone in front of a window, her reflection staring back. She didn't see the uniform, the ribbons, the title. She saw the battlefield, the smoke, the blood. And she wondered, was she building something that would save more lives? Or was she teaching others to carry a burden too heavy for any one person? Her reflection didn't answer. But in the silence, she understood something. Sometimes dignity doesn't mean stepping into the spotlight. Sometimes it means stepping forward when no one else will. And that's what she had done. That's what she would keep doing. How do you teach the impossible? That was the question haunting as she stood in the middle of a barren training field in North Carolina, wind tugging at her uniform, her students watching with expectant eyes. They had been pulled from every corner of special operations, Green Berets, SEAL medics, Air Force, Marine Recon corpsmen, the best of the best. And now they were waiting for her. Lieutenant Commander Rogers, the woman who had done what none of them thought could be done. 12 men. 18 minutes. 0 fatalities. The legend had traveled faster than she had. And now these hardened soldiers stood silent, waiting for her to explain how she had pulled life out of the jaws of death. But how do you put defiance into a lesson plan? She walked slowly along the line of trainees, her boots crunching against gravel. Their eyes followed her, some curious, some skeptical, some almost reverent. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of someone who had bled with her words. You've all trained protocols. You've memorized procedures. You know what the manuals say, but the battlefield doesn't care about manuals. It doesn't care about protocol. It doesn't care what you're supposed to do. She stopped, her gaze sharp. In the desert, protocol told me to take cover, to wait for fire support, to immobilize a spinal injury instead of dragging him under fire, to accept that some casualties couldn't be saved. Her eyes hardened. But if I'd followed protocol, 6 of my patients would have died, maybe more. A ripple passed through the line. No one spoke. She stepped closer, her voice dropping lower. You're not here to memorize rules. You're here to learn how to break them without breaking your patients. You're here to learn how to adapt when the battlefield decides it wants everyone dead. She let the silence hang, let the words sink into them. This isn't about procedures. This is about mindset, about refusal. When death comes for your patients, your only job is to fight it, however you have to, for as long as it takes. The first live fire drill began at dawn. Explosions rocked the training field. Simulated IEDs tore into vehicles. Pyrotechnics filled the air with smoke and fire. Gunfire rattled from the ridges where instructors fired blanks to simulate ambush. And in the middle of it, trauma dummies and role players screaming, bleeding, gasping. The students sprinted into the chaos, their medical kits rattling, rifles slung. They moved fast, efficient, but watched with a critical eye. Too slow. Too careful. Too bound to the rules. One trainee froze when a casualty groaned about spinal pain, torn between immobilizing him and dragging him out of the kill zone. Another dropped to cover when fire erupted, waiting for the enemy to be suppressed before treating the wounded. By the end of the drill, 3 of the simulated casualties were tagged dead. Walked among them, her expression unreadable. You're good medics, she said flatly. Some of the best, but today you lost 3 patients. One trainee bristled. Ma'am, standard protocol. She cut him off sharply. Protocol doesn't bleed out in your arms. Protocol doesn't look you in the eyes and ask if they're going to die. Patients do. Her gaze swept the group. If you can't adapt, if you can't fight the battlefield and treat your patients at the same time, you're not saving anyone. The second drill was harder. This time she armed them with live rounds, not just to fire back, but to teach them the rhythm she had lived through, one moment compressing a wound, the next firing at an enemy silhouette. Your weapon isn't separate from your kit, she told them. It's part of it, because if you can't keep the battlefield at bay, you won't get the chance to save anyone. The exercise rattled them. One trainee tried inserting a chest tube while rounds cracked overhead and nearly botched the angle. Another hesitated between firing at a silhouette and tying off a tourniquet. By the end, they were drenched in sweat, their hands shaking, their nerves frayed. But more patients lived. Progress. Late at night, when the training fields fell silent, sat alone in her office, staring at the reports. She wrote notes on each trainee, marking strengths, weaknesses, what they needed to unlearn as much as what they needed to know. But as her pen scratched across the paper, her mind wandered back, always back. To the desert. To eyes wide with fear. Doc, am I going to die? She pressed her hands against her face, trying to silence the memory, but it wouldn't fade. No matter how many students she trained, no matter how many drills she perfected, she couldn't escape the truth. She hadn't saved those 12 men because of doctrine. She hadn't saved them because of skill alone. She had saved them because she refused to let them die. And you can't teach refusal. On the third week, she gathered her students again, her voice harder than before. Stop looking at me like I have the answers. I don't. The battlefield isn't fair. Sometimes you do everything right and someone still dies. Sometimes you break every rule and they live. That's the truth. She paused, her throat tightening. When I was in that valley, 12 men were bleeding to death. I didn't have time to think about manuals. I didn't have time to debate with myself. I had 18 minutes to choose whether they lived or died, and I chose to make them live. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting each pair of eyes. That's what you're here to learn, not how to follow rules, not how to earn medals, but how to make that choice when everything in you wants to give up. Silence heavy, electric. One trainee finally spoke, his voice quiet. Ma'am, what if we can't? She studied him for a long moment. Then she said the only words she could. Then you're not ready. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, her trainees adapted. They stopped hesitating. They stopped clinging to protocol when the battlefield demanded more. They began to treat medicine and combat as one, not separate. And the death tags dropped. Fewer and fewer patients died in simulations, more lived. They were becoming something new, something the manuals had never envisioned. And word spread again. Across bases, across branches, across the special operations community. They called it the Rogers Protocol. A way of thinking, a way of fighting, a way of healing. Not bound by rules, not limited by doctrine, but rooted in one unshakable truth. Refuse to let them die. Should have felt proud. But instead, late at night, she sat alone again, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her students would be ready. They would save lives. They would carry the protocol into battles she would never see. But she knew the truth. The battlefield wasn't about lessons. It wasn't about drills. It was about moments. Moments that tore you apart, demanded more than you thought you had, and left scars no one else could see. And she wondered, were they ready for that? Could anyone ever be ready for that? Her reflection didn't answer. But her heart did. No, you're never ready. You just refuse. How do you know if your lessons work? Not in the classroom. Not in simulations with blank rounds and fake blood. But when the battlefield comes alive, when real men are bleeding, when death is close enough to breathe on the back of your neck. That question haunted as she sat in the operations center, headset pressed against her ear, listening to the radio chatter from halfway across the world. This time she wasn't on the ground. She wasn't the one running through smoke and fire. She was in a dim room filled with glowing screens, watching dots move across a map, listening to voices crackle in and out with static. And one of those voices belonged to Corporal, her student. The first to carry the Rogers Protocol into real combat. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: recon through a mountain pass. A small team, light vehicles, minimal contact expected. But the desert has a way of laughing at plans. The first explosion hit just like hers had, an IED tearing into the lead vehicle, sending steel and fire into the air. Gunfire followed from the ridges, enemy silhouettes moving like shadows across stone. The radio erupted in chaos, shouts, screams, calls for medics. And then's voice. Multiple casualties, taking fire, I'm moving in. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her breath caught in her throat. He was doing what she had taught, crawling into the storm, refusing to wait. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she wasn't in Washington anymore. She was back in that valley, smoke in her lungs, blood on her hands, ghosts pressing against her mind. Her chest tightened. She had sent into this, taught him to refuse death, but what if refusal killed him? The radio crackled again. His voice was loud, strained, but steady. Patient 1, massive arterial bleed, tourniquet applied, vitals weak but holding. Exhaled sharply, her eyes burning. He was doing it, step by step, just like she'd drilled into him. Gunfire rattled in the background, shouts, then his voice again, firm, commanding. Cover me, I've got 2 more down. Static hissed, then a different voice broke through, another operator panicked. We're surrounded, we need air support now. Didn't flinch, didn't falter, his voice cut through like a blade. Hold the line, I'll keep them alive. Pressed her forehead into her hand, her heart pounding so loud she thought the others in the room could hear it. She had taught him those words, not literally, but the conviction, the refusal, the way he said them like there was no alternative but life. And for the first time she realized what it felt like to be on the other side, to be the one waiting, hopping, terrified. Minutes bled by like hours. Updates came in bursts, chest tube inserted, breathing restored. Second casualty stabilized, moving to third. Enemy fire close, returning fire, patient secure. Each report was a knife twisting deeper into her chest. Pride, fear, pride again. She wanted to scream into the radio, tell him to stay down, to wait, to protect himself. But she knew she couldn't, because if she had been there she wouldn't have. She had taught him to refuse, and now he was. Then came the words she feared most. Third patient critical, abdominal trauma, I don't have time, I need to open him up here. Her blood ran cold. The room went still. The officers around her exchanged glances. One muttered, that's outside protocol. Didn't speak, she couldn't. Because this was the test. The moment when either lived what she had taught or broke under the weight of it. Static filled the air, the sound of gunfire, his breath ragged through the mic. Then his voice, low, fierce, unshakable. I'm going in. For 7 minutes the radio was chaos. Shouts, gunfire, explosions. But through it his voice cut in, steady, determined. Artery clamped. Bleeding controlled. Vitals weak but holding. His hands trembled. She whispered to herself without meaning to, come on, come on. And then his final transmission. All casualties stabilized. Repeat, all casualties stabilized. No fatalities. The room erupted in cheers. Officers clapped each other on the back. Someone muttered, unbelievable. But didn't cheer. She lowered her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking. Relief flooded her like a wave, but beneath it, something heavier lingered. Because she knew what it had cost him. And she knew he would never be the same. Hours later, when the dust had settled and reports came in, sat alone in the corner of the operations center, the glow of the screens painting her face pale. Had lived, his team had lived. The Rogers protocol had been proven in combat. It should have felt like victory. But all she felt was the weight of the question pressing against her heart. Had she saved them by teaching him? Or had she condemned him to carry the same burden she would never escape? 2 weeks later, she met him. He walked into the debriefing room in fatigue still dusty from the field, his face pale but his eyes sharp. He spotted her instantly, his expression breaking into a grin. "Ma'am," he said, snapping a salute. She returned it slowly, her chest tight. "I heard the reports. You saved them." His grin widened but his eyes softened. "I just did what you taught me, refused to let them die." The words hit her harder than she expected, because he said them like they were simple, easy. But she knew the truth. They weren't simple, they were heavy, they left scars you couldn't see. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "How are you sleeping?" The grin faltered, his shoulders sagged, his eyes darkened. "Not well, ma'am," he admitted. "I keep hearing their voices, seeing their faces, wondering if I did everything right." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him it would fade, that time would heal it, that the weight would lift. But she couldn't lie. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady, quiet. "You did what mattered. You gave them life. The weight never goes away, but neither does the fact that they're alive because of you." His eyes met hers, filled with both pain and gratitude. He nodded slowly. And in that moment, she realized this was the true test of the Rogers Protocol. Not whether it saved lives, but whether those who carried it could live with the burden it left behind. That night, as she walked alone through the Pentagon corridors, her footsteps echoing against marble floors, she thought of the desert again, of the 12 men, of the 18 minutes that had defined her life. And she thought of his young face already lined with shadows, already marked by the burden she had passed on to him. She knew more battles would come, more students, more lives saved, but also more scars. And she wondered, not for the first time, if she had done the right thing. Because sometimes teaching others to fight death also meant teaching them to carry its weight. And that was a weight no one should bear alone. What does it mean to be honored for something you never wanted to be remembered for? That was the question heavy in his chest as she stood in her dress whites, the Pentagon's grand hall filled with the weight of silence and expectation. Rows of uniforms stretched out before her, families in the crowd, media cameras hidden behind velvet ropes. At the far end of the hall, a podium gleamed under bright light. And beside it, a citation waiting to be read aloud. Lieutenant Commander Rogers was about to receive the Silver Star. But she didn't want it, not really. Because medals don't erase screams. They don't silence the memory of blood on your hands. They don't heal the weight you carry long after the battlefield goes quiet. And she carried all of it. The general's voice boomed across the hall, formal, rehearsed. For gallantry in action while serving as medical officer with a Navy SEAL element during combat operations. Lieutenant Commander Rogers, exceptional medical skill, innovative trauma techniques, and unwavering dedication resulted in the survival of 12 critically wounded personnel under extreme combat conditions. The words floated, polished, practiced, but wasn't hearing them. She was hearing something else. Labored breath, cracked voice, William's whispering, "Sarah and Michael." Trembling words, "Doc, am I going to die?" She swallowed hard, her hands tightening at her sides. The medal meant nothing compared to those voices. The general pinned the Silver Star to her chest. Applause filled the hall, echoing against marble walls. Stood still, her face calm, her eyes steady, but inside she was shaking. Because this wasn't about her, it was about them. The men who had bled in the sand, The ones who had looked at her with fadding eyes, trusting her to hold them against death. And the ones who had lived because she refused to let go. After the ceremony, the crowd pressed in, generals shaking her hand, officers offering congratulations, reporters snapping photos. She smiled politely, nodded when she had to, answered questions with as few words as possible. But the moment that mattered came quietly. One by one, the 12 men she had saved approached her. First, walking on a prosthetic leg, his daughter's hand in his. He held out a folded piece of paper, his eyes wet. "My little girl made this for you," he said softly. Unfolded it, a crayon drawing, a woman in uniform, rifle in one hand, stethoscope around her neck, stick figures labeled Daddy's friends standing behind her. At the bottom, in messy handwriting, "Thank you for saving Daddy." Her throat closed, she forced a smile. Tell her it's perfect." His eyes shone. "She thinks you're a superhero." Shook her head. "I'm not, I'm just a nurse." But deep down, she knew the truth. Superheroes weren't invincible. They just refused to stop fighting. Came next, his face stern but his eyes soft. He clasped her hand firmly. "You didn't just treat me," he said. "You ordered me to stay alive, and I did because of you." She blinked, her chest heavy. "You saved yourself, Chief. I just kept you steady long enough to do it." But he shook his head. "No, Doc, you carried us all." One by one they came. Williams, Martinez, Santos, Lee, Johnson, Brown, Davis, White, Morgan. Each man had a scar, a limp, a memory they couldn't shake. But each man was alive. And each man looked at her with the same thing in their eyes. Gratitude. Later that night at the reception, found her standing alone by a window, the city lights stretching across the horizon. He stepped beside her, his voice quiet. "When I first met you," he said, "I thought medical personnel were support staff. I thought you were there to stay behind the lines, to fix cuts and hand out bandages." He turned, his gaze steady on her. "You taught me I was wrong. You taught me that medical personnel are warriors, warriors who fight death instead of enemy soldiers." She looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes calm, unreadable. "Commander," she said softly, "we're all on the same team. We just use different tools." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but your tools saved us all." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken memories between them. Then lifted his glass, nodding once. "To the Rogers protocol." Didn't raise hers, she only whispered to the men who lived. Years passed. She continued to serve. Missions came and went. Students trained under her and carried the Rogers protocol into their own battles. Some succeeded, some broke under the weight. But the doctrine spread, across branches, across countries, across wars. And her name traveled with it. Not as a legend, not as a hero, but as a quiet truth whispered among medics on the edge of impossible battles. Refuse to let them die. 5 years later, she stood in front of another classroom. Her hair streaked with gray now, her face harder, but her eyes still steady. Her students sat silent, waiting. She spoke slowly, deliberately. "Anyone can learn procedures. Anyone can memorize protocols, but that won't save your patients. What saves them is mindset, refusal, the certainty that they will live because you refuse to let them die." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "The battlefield will test you. It will break you. It will demand everything you have. And when it does, you'll hear voices in your head telling you to give up, telling you it's over. Don't listen. Because sometimes, the difference between a soldier going home or never leaving the sand is just one person refusing to quit." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "And sometimes, that one person has to be you." That night, alone in her quarters, she sat by the window again, the world outside quiet. Her hands rested on her lap. Her silver star gleamed faintly on the shelf across the room. She stared at it for a long time, then closed her eyes. She didn't think of medals. She didn't think of titles. She thought of 12 men, 12 faces, 12 promises she had kept. And she realized something she had always known, but never put into words. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't even need to be remembered. Sometimes dignity simply acts. And that was all she had ever done.